David wiped the sweat from his forehead as he pushed the lawnmower back into his garage. The morning sun was already getting hot, but he felt good about getting the yard work done early. His house looked perfect now, just the way he liked it. The grass was neat and even, the edges were trimmed, and everything was in its place. He had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years now, and he genuinely loved it here. The houses were nice, the streets were clean, and most of his neighbors were friendly people who minded their own business. Sure, there was a homeowners association, but they had never bothered him before. David always kept his property looking good, paid his fees on time through automatic bank payments, and followed all the rules. As he was coiling up the garden hose, David noticed 3 people walking up his driveway. They looked serious and official, carrying clipboards and wearing what appeared to be some kind of badges. The woman leading the group had short gray hair pulled back tightly and wore a dark blue blazer that looked like it had seen better days. The 2 men behind her were dressed similarly, though one wore a wrinkled polo shirt instead of a blazer. David set down the hose and walked toward them, wiping his hands on his jeans. He figured they might be from the city, maybe doing some kind of inspection or survey. People like this came around the neighborhood from time to time for various reasons. "Good morning," David said with a friendly smile. "Can I help you folks with something?" The woman in the blazer looked down at her clipboard, then back up at David with a stern expression. "Are you David Rodriguez?" she asked, though she pronounced his last name wrong. "Yes, that's me," David replied, though he corrected her pronunciation. "What's this about?" The woman introduced herself as Patricia Wells from the HOA Enforcement Division. David had never heard of any HOA Enforcement Division before, but he figured maybe they had created some new department. The 2 men with her didn't give their names, just stood there looking intimidating with their arms crossed. Patricia flipped through several pages on her clipboard before looking back at David. "Mr. Rodriguez, we're here because you have outstanding violations and unpaid fees totaling $2,847. David felt his stomach drop. That was a lot of money, and he had no idea what she was talking about. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some kind of mistake," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I pay my HOA fees automatically every month through my bank. Have been for 3 years. Patricia's expression didn't change. She pulled out what looked like an official document and held it up for David to see. "According to our records, you have 8 months of unpaid fees, plus violations for improper lawn maintenance, unauthorized exterior modifications, and failure to maintain property standards." David looked at the paper, but something felt off about it. The letterhead looked strange, and the language seemed overly complicated. More importantly, none of what she was saying made sense. His lawn was perfect. He hadn't made any modifications to his house, and he definitely had been paying his fees. "Look," David said, "I think there's been a mix-up here. I can show you my bank statements. The HOA fees come out automatically on the 15th of every month. And what violations are you talking about?" "My property looks great." One of the men behind Patricia stepped forward. He was tall and had a shaved head, and something about his demeanor made David uncomfortable. "Sir, arguing with us isn't going to help your situation," the man said in a tone that sounded more like a threat than advice. David felt his pulse quicken. This whole thing was getting weird fast. "I'm not arguing," he said. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on. I've never received any notices about violations or unpaid fees." Patricia made a note on her clipboard. "Our records show that multiple notices were sent to this address. Failure to receive notices doesn't excuse non-payment or non-compliance." By now, David noticed that some of his neighbors had started to take notice of what was happening. Mrs. Chen from next door was pretending to water her plants while obviously listening to the conversation. Across the street, he could see Tom looking out his window. David felt embarrassed that this was happening in front of everyone, but he also felt relieved that people were watching. "Can I see some identification?" David asked. "And maybe some official documentation about these supposed violations?" Patricia's face hardened. "We don't need to provide identification to property owners who are in violation of HOA regulations. What we need is for you to pay the outstanding balance immediately." The second man, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Cash or certified check only. No personal checks or credit cards." David's confusion was turning into alarm. This was getting stranger by the minute. In his 3 years of living here, he had never heard of the HOA demanding immediate cash payment for anything. Usually these things went through proper channels, with official letters and reasonable payment plans. I'm going to need to call my bank and verify my payment history, David said, and I'd like to contact the HOA office directly to confirm this. Patricia shook her head. The HOA office directed us here. They don't want to deal with delinquent accounts anymore. That's why they created our enforcement division. David had attended several HOA meetings over the years, and he had never heard anything about an enforcement division. The HOA board consisted of 5 neighbors who volunteered their time. They weren't the type of people to hire muscle to collect fees. Which HOA office are you talking about? David asked. Our HOA doesn't have an office. The board members are all volunteers who live in the neighborhood. For just a moment, Patricia looked flustered, but she quickly recovered and became even more aggressive. Mr. Rodriguez, you're wasting our time with these questions. The fact is you owe this money and you need to pay it now. The bald man stepped closer to David. We have the authority to take action if you refuse to cooperate. David felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of action are you talking about? Patricia consulted her clipboard again. Continued noncompliance can result in liens against your property, legal action, and in extreme cases, arrest for theft of services. Arrest? David couldn't believe what he was hearing. You can't arrest someone for HOA fees. Actually, we can, the bald man said with a slight smile that made David's skin crawl. New county ordinance. Theft of services is a criminal matter now. David knew enough about the law to know this sounded completely wrong, but these people seemed so confident and official that he started to doubt himself. Maybe there really had been some new rules passed that he wasn't aware of. Mrs. Chen had stopped pretending to water her plants and was now openly staring at the confrontation. David could see her phone in her hand, though he couldn't tell if she was recording or just ready to call someone. Look, David said, trying one more time to be reasonable. I'm happy to sort this out, but I need some time to verify everything. Can we schedule a time to meet later this week? Patricia shook her head firmly. This matter needs to be resolved today, right now. The quiet man pulled out his phone. Patricia, should I make the call? David felt panic rising in his chest. What call? Call who? Our enforcement partner, Patricia said coldly. Since you're refusing to cooperate, we'll have to escalate this to the next level. David's mind was racing. Something was very wrong here, but he wasn't sure what to do. These people seemed so official and confident. But everything they were saying contradicted his experience with the HOA. He had never been in trouble before. Never had any disputes with neighbors or the association. As he stood there trying to figure out his next move, he heard his front door open behind him. His wife Maria appeared, still in her pajamas and looking concerned. David, what's going on out here? She called from the doorway. Patricia turned toward Maria with the same stern expression. Ma'am, your husband owes significant fees to the homeowners association and he's refusing to pay. Maria looked confused and came down the driveway toward them. Refusing to pay? We've never missed a payment. They take it out of our account automatically. That's what I've been trying to tell them, David said, feeling relieved that Maria was there to back him up. But Patricia just shook her head. Ma'am, our records show no payments from this address for 8 months. The man with the phone finished his call and nodded to Patricia. He's on his way. David felt like the situation was spiraling completely out of control. Who's on his way? What's happening here? Our enforcement officer, Patricia said. Since you won't resolve this voluntarily, we'll have to pursue other options. David felt his heart pounding as he watched Patricia and her associates exchange meaningful looks. The whole situation had gone from confusing to genuinely frightening in just a few minutes. Maria moved closer to David and he could feel her tension matching his own. What kind of enforcement officer? Maria asked, her voice shaky. David, what's going on? Before David could answer, a police car turned onto their street. At least it looked like a police car from a distance. As it got closer, though, David noticed that something seemed off about it. The paint job was right and it had lights on top, but the markings looked slightly different from the city police cars he was used to seeing. The car pulled up to the curb in front of their house and a man in what appeared to be a police uniform got out. He was stocky and middle-aged with a thick mustache and sunglasses that hid his eyes. His uniform looked official enough, but again, something about it didn't quite seem right to David. Patricia walked over to meet the man, and they had a brief, quiet conversation. David couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw the man nod several times and look over at him and Maria. By now, more neighbors had come out to see what was happening. Tom from across the street was standing on his front porch, and the Johnsons from 2 houses down were in their yard, making no attempt to hide their curiosity. David felt mortified that this was becoming such a public spectacle, but he was also grateful that witnesses were around. The man in the uniform walked over to David with Patricia beside him. "Good morning, sir. I'm Officer Rodriguez with the County HOA Enforcement Unit. I understand there's a problem here with unpaid fees." David noticed that the man had the same last name as him, though they clearly weren't related. It seemed like an odd coincidence. "Officer Rodriguez, I think there's been some kind of mistake. I've been paying my HOA fees for 3 years without any problems." Officer Rodriguez pulled out a small notebook and flipped through it. "Sir, according to these records, you haven't made a payment in 8 months. That constitutes theft of services under the new county ordinance." "Theft of services?" Maria stepped forward. "That's ridiculous. We can prove we've been paying. David, go get the bank statements from inside." But Officer Rodriguez held up his hand. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and let me handle this." David didn't like the tone the officer was using with his wife. "She's just trying to help. We can clear this up really quickly if you'll just let us show you our payment records." "Sir, the time for documentation has passed," Officer Rodriguez said, his voice getting firmer. "These folks have given you multiple opportunities to resolve this matter voluntarily. Now it's become a legal issue." Patricia opened her folder and pulled out what looked like an official document. "Officer Rodriguez, here's the warrant for Mr. Rodriguez's arrest." David's blood ran cold. "Arrest warrant? For what?" "Theft of services, failure to comply with HOA regulations, and obstruction of an investigation." Officer Rodriguez read from the paper that Patricia had handed him. Maria grabbed David's arm. "This is insane. You can't arrest someone for HOA fees." "David, call the police. Call the real police." Officer Rodriguez's expression hardened behind his sunglasses. "Ma'am, I am the real police, and I'm going to need you to step back and let me do my job." David's mind was racing. Everything about this felt wrong. But the man was wearing a uniform and had what looked like official documents. Could there really be some new law that he wasn't aware of? Could he really be arrested for this? "Officer, can I see some identification?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "And can I call my attorney before we proceed with anything?" Officer Rodriguez reached for his belt, and David saw what looked like handcuffs hanging there. "Sir, you're in no position to be making demands. You've already been given multiple chances to resolve this peacefully." "But I'm telling you, I've been paying my fees," David insisted. "This is all some kind of misunderstanding." The bald man, who had been quiet during most of the conversation, stepped forward again. "Sir, arguing with a police officer is only going to make things worse for you." David noticed that several of his neighbors now had their phones out, and he was pretty sure they were recording the whole thing. Part of him felt embarrassed that this was being filmed, but another part of him was glad there would be evidence of whatever was about to happen. "David," Maria whispered urgently, "something's not right here. That doesn't look like a real police car, and his uniform is wrong." David had been thinking the same thing, but he wasn't sure what to do about it. If these people were legitimate, challenging them could make things much worse. But if they weren't legitimate, then what were they trying to accomplish? Officer Rodriguez unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm placing you under arrest for theft of services and failure to comply with lawful orders. You have the right to remain silent." Wait, David said, putting his hands up. "This is moving way too fast. Can we please just slow down and figure out what's going on here?" Patricia consulted her clipboard again. "Mr. Rodriguez, you can still resolve this without arrest if you're willing to pay the full amount right now. Cash or certified check." Maria looked at David desperately. "David, don't give them any money. This whole thing is a scam. I can feel it," but David was scared. The sight of the handcuffs had shaken him badly. Even if this was some kind of mistake, getting arrested would be a nightmare. It would affect his job, his reputation, everything. "How much did you say it was again?" he asked quietly. $2,847, Patricia said promptly, plus a $200 processing fee for the enforcement action. David felt sick. That was more than $3,000 total. He had the money in his savings account, but spending it on something like this would be a huge financial hit for his family. "David, no," Maria said firmly. We're not paying money we don't owe to people who won't even show us proper identification. Officer Rodriguez stepped closer to David. Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. Wait, David said, panic rising in his voice. Just give me a second to think. The whole street seemed to be watching now. David could see people standing in doorways and looking out windows. Some of his neighbors were clearly recording with their phones, and a few others were talking in small groups, pointing toward the confrontation. Mrs. Chen from next door called out, David, is everything okay over there? Officer Rodriguez turned toward her with an annoyed expression. Ma'am, this is official police business. I need everyone to go back inside. But Mrs. Chen didn't move. David's a good neighbor. He always keeps his yard nice and pays his bills. This doesn't make sense. Patricia glared at Mrs. Chen. Ma'am, you don't know anything about this situation. Please mind your own business. It is my business if you're harassing my neighbor. Mrs. Chen shot back. David felt a surge of gratitude toward Mrs. Chen for standing up for him. But he was also worried that the situation was getting even more out of control. Officer Rodriguez put his hand on David's shoulder. Sir, I need you to turn around right now. Okay, David said, his voice shaking. But can I please just show you my identification first? I think there might be some confusion about who I am. Patricia rolled her eyes. We know exactly who you are, Mr. Rodriguez. Your name is on the property records. But maybe there's been some mix-up with the records, David insisted. Can I just show you my ID to make sure we're talking about the right person? Officer Rodriguez looked at Patricia, who shrugged. Fine, he said. Show me your identification, but make it quick. David reached for his back pocket where he kept his wallet. His hands were shaking as he pulled it out. Partly from fear and partly from adrenaline, Maria moved closer to him and he could see the worry in her eyes. As David opened his wallet to pull out his driver's license, he felt a small surge of hope. Maybe when they saw his identification, they would realize they had made some kind of mistake. Maybe this whole nightmare would finally start to make sense. He pulled out his ID and held it toward Officer Rodriguez. Here's my driver's license. And I have other identification too if you need it. Officer Rodriguez took the license and looked at it briefly, but as he examined it more closely, David noticed his expression change. The officer's confident demeanor seemed to falter slightly, and he looked up at David with a confused expression. Patricia stepped closer. What is it? What's the problem? Officer Rodriguez handed the license back to David without saying anything. He looked uncomfortable for the first time since he had arrived. Officer, is there a problem? David asked, sensing that something had shifted in the dynamic. Patricia grabbed the license from David's hand before he could put it away. As she looked at it, her face went completely white. Her hand started shaking as she stared at the small plastic card. What is it? The bald man asked, moving closer to see what had Patricia so shaken. But Patricia just stood there, staring at David's identification with a look of pure terror on her face. David watched as Patricia's face drained of all color. She was staring at his driver's license like it was some kind of dangerous weapon. Her hands were actually trembling as she held the small plastic card, and her confident, aggressive demeanor had completely disappeared. Patricia, what's wrong? The bald man asked, clearly confused by her sudden change in behavior. But Patricia didn't answer. She just kept staring at the license, her mouth slightly open in shock. David could see sweat beginning to form on her forehead, despite the morning being relatively cool. Officer Rodriguez stepped closer to Patricia. What's going on? What's the problem with his ID? Finally, Patricia managed to speak, though her voice was barely a whisper. He's a federal housing inspector. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. David saw Officer Rodriguez's eyes widen behind his sunglasses, and the bald man took a step backward as if David had suddenly become radioactive. David felt confused but also relieved that his identification had caused such a strong reaction. He wasn't entirely sure why being a federal housing inspector was such a big deal to these people, but their fear was obvious and immediate. That's right, David said, his confidence returning for the first time since this whole ordeal had started. I work for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I inspect housing properties and investigate housing violations across the region. Maria looked at David with surprise and relief. She knew what he did for work, of course, but she had never seen it have this kind of effect on anyone before. Patricia was still holding David's license, but now she was looking at it like it might bite her. "You're a federal inspector," she repeated as if saying it out loud would help her process the information. "Yes," David said calmly. "And what you folks are doing here today is very interesting to me from a professional perspective." Officer Rodriguez had gone very quiet. He was no longer making any move toward the handcuffs, and his aggressive posture had completely changed. In fact, he looked like he wanted to be anywhere but David's driveway. The bald man cleared his throat nervously. Patricia, maybe we should go back and double-check our records." But David wasn't ready to let them leave just yet. His fear was being replaced by professional curiosity and growing anger at what these people had put him and his wife through. "Actually," David said, "before anyone goes anywhere, I'd like to understand exactly what kind of operation you folks are running here." Patricia tried to hand the license back to David, but her hands were shaking so badly that she almost dropped it. "Mr. Rodriguez, there's obviously been some kind of mistake in our records." "What kind of mistake?" David asked, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when conducting official inspections. "You told me I owe nearly $3,000 in unpaid fees and violations. You threatened to have me arrested. Now suddenly there's a mistake?" Officer Rodriguez was backing toward his car. "Look, this is obviously a misunderstanding. We'll just head back to the office and sort this out." "Officer Rodriguez," David said sharply, "I'd like to see your badge and identification before you leave." The man in the uniform froze. My badge?" "Yes, your badge. Your official identification. And while we're at it, I'd like to see the official documentation authorizing this enforcement action." David had spent years dealing with various law enforcement agencies in his work, and he knew exactly what proper identification and documentation should look like. More importantly, he knew what his federal authority meant in situations like this. Patricia was frantically shuffling through her papers. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm sure we can work this out. There's no need to make this into a big federal case." "Actually," David said, "threatening a federal housing inspector with arrest over fake HOA violations might already be a federal case." Maria was watching the whole scene with amazement. She had never seen her husband in full professional mode before, and she was impressed by how completely the power dynamic had shifted. Mrs. Chen, who had been watching from her yard, called out again. "David, should I call the real police?" Officer Rodriguez looked panicked at the suggestion. "That's not necessary. We're just going to leave and sort this out at the office." But David wasn't done. "Officer Rodriguez, you still haven't shown me your badge or identification. As a federal inspector, I have the authority to verify the credentials of any law enforcement officer operating in my jurisdiction." The fake officer's face had gone pale. I left my badge in the car." "Then please go get it," David said calmly. "I'll wait." Patricia was desperately trying to signal to the fake officer, making frantic gestures behind David's back. But David caught the exchange in his peripheral vision. "Ms. Wells," David said, using Patricia's last name for the first time, "are you trying to communicate something to Officer Rodriguez?" Patricia's face went red. "No, we just need to get back to the office to straighten out our records." David pulled out his own phone. "I think before anyone leaves, I should contact my supervisor at HUD and report this incident." The three fraudsters exchanged panicked looks. The fake officer was now standing by his car, clearly ready to jump in and drive away at any moment. "Mr. Rodriguez," Patricia said desperately, "there's really no need to involve federal authorities in what's obviously just a clerical error." "A clerical error?" David's voice was getting louder. "You threatened to arrest me for theft of services. You demanded $3,000 in cash. You brought what appears to be a fake police officer to my home to intimidate me and my wife. That's not a clerical error." The bald man was also backing away now. "Patricia, I think we should go," but David wasn't finished. "Actually, I'd like all three of you to stay right here while I make some phone calls. As a federal inspector, I have reasonable suspicion that a crime has been attempted here." Officer Rodriguez was clearly terrified now. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding about my authority here." "What authority?" David asked pointedly. "You still haven't shown me any proper identification or documentation. What agency do you work for? What's your badge number? Who's your supervisor?" The fake officer couldn't answer any of these questions, and his silence was telling. Maria had been quiet during most of this exchange, but now she spoke up. "David, I think we should definitely call the real police. Good idea, David said, starting to dial his phone. I'm also going to call the FBI's white-collar crime division. They handle this kind of fraud. At the mention of the FBI, Patricia looked like she might faint. Mr. Rodriguez, please, there's no need to escalate this. We'll just go back to the office and remove you from our enforcement list. What office? David demanded. Our HOA doesn't have an office. Our HOA board consists of 5 volunteers who live in this neighborhood. So where exactly is this office you keep mentioning? Patricia couldn't answer. She was trapped in her own lies, and David's professional knowledge of housing law and HOA operations was exposing every hole in their story. The fake officer suddenly jumped into his car. I have to respond to another call, he said through the window. Officer Rodriguez, David called out loudly. You're leaving the scene of a potential federal crime. I strongly advise against that. But the fake officer was already starting his engine. David quickly took several photos of the car and its license plate with his phone. Patricia, David said, turning back to the remaining 2 fraudsters, I think you and your associate need to explain exactly what kind of operation you're running here. But Patricia and the bald man were also preparing to leave. We'll be in touch, Mr. Rodriguez, Patricia said weakly as she backed toward the street. Actually, David said, I'll be in touch with you. I have your names, your descriptions, and photos of your fake police car. The FBI is very interested in schemes that target homeowners with fraudulent enforcement actions. As the 2 remaining scammers hurried away, David's neighbors began gathering around him. Mrs. Chen was the first to reach him. David, what just happened here? She asked. Who are those people? David was still processing everything himself. I think they were running some kind of scam, targeting homeowners with fake HOA violations. Tom from across the street jogged over. Did they really try to arrest you for HOA fees? That's crazy. It gets crazier, Maria said. They demanded $3,000 in cash. Mrs. Chen shook her head in disgust. I knew something was wrong when they wouldn't show proper identification. Real officials always have proper ID. David was already on his phone, dialing his supervisor at HUD. This incident was definitely something that needed to be reported through official channels. As a federal housing inspector, he had seen various types of housing fraud before, but he had never been personally targeted by scammers. As he waited for his supervisor to answer, David realized how lucky he had been. If he had been any other homeowner, he might have been intimidated enough to pay the money, or worse, he might have actually been arrested by the fake officer. His federal credentials had not only saved him, but had completely turned the tables on the scammers. The phone rang twice before his supervisor picked up. This is David Rodriguez, he said. I need to report an attempted fraud involving fake HOA enforcement and impersonation of law enforcement. And I think we're going to need to involve the FBI. David's supervisor, Linda Williams, was immediately concerned when David explained what had happened. As a senior official at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, she understood the serious implications of what David was describing. David, you're absolutely right to report this, Linda said over the phone. What you're describing sounds like a coordinated fraud scheme targeting homeowners. The fake police officer makes this even more serious. Within 2 hours of David's call, his quiet suburban street was bustling with activity. First, 2 real police officers arrived to take David's statement and collect evidence. Then came 2 FBI agents from the white-collar crime division, followed by a HUD investigator who worked with David's department. Agent Thompson from the FBI was particularly interested in the details of how the scammers had operated. Mr. Rodriguez, you mentioned they had official-looking documents and badges. Can you describe them in detail? David walked Agent Thompson through everything he could remember about the fake documents Patricia had shown him. The letterhead looked professional, but something about it seemed off. The language was overly complicated, and the violations they listed didn't make sense. Maria had been listening to David give his statement to various officials throughout the day. The whole thing felt wrong from the beginning, she told Agent Thompson. David always pays his bills on time, and our property is always well maintained. The violations they claimed made no sense. Agent Thompson nodded as he took notes. These types of scams often rely on intimidation and the appearance of authority. Most people don't know enough about the law to challenge what appears to be official action. The HUD investigator, James Peterson, was particularly concerned about the implications for the broader community. If they tried this with you, David, They've probably tried it with other homeowners who don't have your knowledge and authority. This thought had been bothering David all day. He kept thinking about elderly neighbors or people who might not speak English as their first language being targeted by these scammers. The idea of people being intimidated into paying thousands of dollars they didn't owe made him angry. "We need to canvass the neighborhood," David suggested. "Find out if anyone else has been approached by these people." Agent Thompson agreed. "We're already planning to do that. But having you help with that canvass would be valuable, since neighbors trust you and you understand the technical aspects of HOA law." Over the next few days, David and the investigators discovered that the scam was much bigger than anyone had initially realized. Going door to door through his neighborhood and several surrounding areas, they found dozens of families who had been approached by Patricia and her associates. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived 3 streets over, broke down crying when David and Agent Thompson spoke with her. "They came to my house last month," she said. "I was so scared when they threatened to arrest me. I gave them $1,500 because I didn't know what else to do." David felt sick when he heard stories like Mrs. Patterson's. The scammers had been specifically targeting vulnerable people, elderly residents, recent immigrants, and families who were struggling financially and couldn't afford legal help. Tom Chen, Mrs. Chen's adult son who was visiting from college, had actually recorded part of his encounter with the scammers on his phone 3 weeks earlier. "I thought something was weird about it," he told the investigators. "But they left when I started asking too many questions." The investigation revealed that the fake Officer Rodriguez was actually named Robert Wells, Patricia's brother-in-law. He had been fired from a security company 2 years earlier for misconduct and had been using his old uniform and a fake police car he had purchased online agent. Thompson showed David photos that other victims had taken of the fake police car. "He's been using this setup for at least 6 months, the agent explained. "We're tracking down where he got the car and the equipment." David learned that Patricia Wells had no official connection to any HOA enforcement agency because no such agency existed in their county. She had been creating fake letterhead and documents using a home computer and printer. "The scary thing is how professional it all looked," David told Agent Thompson. "If I hadn't known about housing law through my job, I might have been fooled too." The FBI investigation expanded rapidly as they traced the scope of the fraud. Bank records showed that Patricia and Robert had collected over $180,000 from victims across 3 counties over the past 8 months. Agent Thompson kept David updated on the investigation's progress. "We've identified at least 47 victims so far," she told him during one of their regular check-ins. "Some people paid multiple times because Patricia would come back with new fake violations." David was amazed by the scale of the operation. How did they pick their targets? Was there some pattern? "They seemed to focus on well-maintained properties in middle-class neighborhoods," Agent Thompson explained. "Properties that looked like the owners cared about their homes and would be motivated to avoid problems with an HOA." The investigation also revealed that the 3rd member of their team, the bald man, was Patricia's nephew named Kevin Wells. He had a criminal history of minor fraud and had been helping his aunt and uncle run the scam. As the evidence mounted, David found himself playing an increasingly important role in the investigation. His expertise in housing law helped the FBI understand the technical aspects of the fraud, and his federal credentials gave him credibility with other victims who were initially reluctant to come forward. "A lot of people are embarrassed that they fell for this," David told Maria one evening after spending another day helping with victim interviews. "They feel stupid for giving money to these scammers." Maria shook her head sadly. "They shouldn't feel stupid. These people were professional criminals who knew exactly how to manipulate and intimidate people." One of the most disturbing discoveries was that Patricia and her associates had been keeping detailed files on their victims. When the FBI searched Patricia's home, they found spreadsheets tracking which families had paid, how much they had paid, and notes about which approach worked best with different types of people. They had notes about Mrs. Patterson, David told Agent Thompson angrily. They specifically targeted her because she lived alone and seemed nervous when they first approached her. The evidence also showed that the scammers had been planning to expand their operation to other regions. They had been researching HOA laws in neighboring states and had already purchased fake letterhead for fictional HOA enforcement agencies in 3 other cities. David realized how Fortunate he had been that his federal identification had scared them off. If they had succeeded in collecting money from him, it would have validated their approach and encouraged them to continue targeting other families. Agent Thompson told David that his quick thinking and professional knowledge had likely prevented many more people from being victimized. "Your report came at exactly the right time," she said. "We were able to shut this down before they moved to other areas." The investigation also uncovered connections to other fraud schemes. Robert Wells, the fake officer, had been involved in several other scams over the years, including fake charity collections and phony home repair services. "These people are career criminals," Agent Thompson explained to David. "They move from one type of fraud to another, always looking for new ways to take advantage of honest people." As the FBI prepared to make arrests, David felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He was glad that justice was being pursued, but he was heartbroken by the stories of the families who had been victimized. "The financial damage is just part of it," he told Maria. "These people lost their sense of security in their own neighborhoods. They were afraid in their own homes." Agent Thompson assured David that the FBI was committed to getting justice for all the victims. "We have enough evidence to pursue serious federal charges," she said, "and we're working with prosecutors to ensure that restitution is part of any plea agreement." David had never imagined that his quiet Saturday morning of yard work would lead to uncovering a major fraud operation, but as he reflected on everything that had happened, he realized that his experience demonstrated how important it was for people to know their rights and question authority when something doesn't seem right. "The scariest part," he told his supervisor, Linda, during one of their debriefings, "is thinking about how many people might be out there right now dealing with similar scams that haven't been reported yet." 3 weeks after the initial incident at David's house, the FBI was ready to make arrests. Agent Thompson called David early on a Tuesday morning to let him know that warrants had been issued for Patricia Wells, Robert Wells, and Kevin Wells. "We're moving today," Agent Thompson told David. "All 3 of them will be in federal custody by this evening." David felt a surge of satisfaction, but also relief. Even though he knew the investigation was ongoing, part of him had been worried that the scammers might try to retaliate against him for exposing their operation. The arrests went smoothly. Patricia was taken into custody at her home, where FBI agents also seized computers, printers, and boxes of fake documents. Robert was arrested at a coffee shop, where he was apparently meeting with another potential victim. Kevin was picked up at his apartment, where agents found additional evidence of the fraud scheme. All 3 were charged with multiple federal crimes, including wire fraud, mail fraud, impersonating a federal officer, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The charges carried potential prison sentences of up to 20 years each. David was asked to testify before the federal grand jury that would decide whether to formally indict the 3 suspects. It was his first time appearing before a grand jury, and he was nervous despite his professional experience with legal proceedings. Mr. Rodriguez, the prosecutor, asked him, "In your professional opinion as a federal housing inspector, were the documents shown to you by the defendants consistent with legitimate HOA enforcement actions?" "Not at all," David replied. "The documents contained multiple legal errors and referenced non-existent enforcement authorities. No legitimate HOA in our area has the type of enforcement division that these individuals claim to represent." The grand jury was particularly interested in David's expertise regarding housing law and HOA operations. His testimony helped establish that the defendants had deliberately created false documents designed to deceive homeowners about their legal obligations. After hearing testimony from David and several other victims, the grand jury voted to indict all 3 defendants on all charges. David felt proud that his professional knowledge had contributed to the pursuit of justice. The case moved through the federal court system relatively quickly. Faced with overwhelming evidence and testimony from nearly 50 victims, Patricia Wells decided to accept a plea agreement rather than go to trial. She's agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for cooperating with our investigation of other potential fraud schemes, Agent Thompson told David. "Her cooperation is helping us identify other criminal networks that might be operating similar scams." Robert Wells, the fake police officer, initially tried to fight the charges, but when prosecutors showed him the evidence they had collected, including multiple recordings of him impersonating an officer. He also decided to plead guilty. Kevin Wells, who had played a smaller role in the operation, was the first to be sentenced. He received 3 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution to all victims. David attended Kevin's sentencing hearing, along with several other victims. It was emotional to see Mrs. Patterson and other elderly victims give impact statements about how the fraud had affected their lives. "I couldn't sleep for weeks after they came to my house," Mrs. Patterson told the judge. "I felt so foolish for giving them money, and I was afraid they would come back and demand more." The judge was clearly moved by the victim impact statements. "The defendants in this case deliberately targeted vulnerable members of our community," the judge said during sentencing. "They used fear and intimidation to steal money from hardworking families who were simply trying to follow the rules." Patricia Wells was sentenced next. Because she had been the ringleader of the operation, she received the harshest sentence: 5 years in federal prison plus 3 years of supervised release. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, which totaled over $180,000. Robert Wells, whose impersonation of a police officer was considered an aggravating factor, received 4 years in prison plus restitution obligations. During Patricia's sentencing hearing, David was asked to give a victim impact statement even though he hadn't actually lost any money to the scam. "Your Honor," David told the court, "while I wasn't financially harmed by these defendants, their actions had a significant impact on my family and my community. They brought fear and intimidation to my neighborhood, and they damaged the trust that neighbors should have in legitimate authority figures." David also spoke about the broader impact of the fraud scheme. "These defendants didn't just steal money," he said. "They stole people's sense of security in their own homes. They made elderly residents afraid to answer their doors. They created fear and suspicion in communities that should be safe and welcoming." The restitution process took several months to complete, but eventually all victims received full compensation for the money they had paid to the scammers. Mrs. Patterson was among those who got her $1,500 back, though she told David that the money couldn't undo the emotional trauma she had experienced. "I'm grateful to get the money back," she said. "But I'm even more grateful that these people won't be able to hurt anyone else for a while." The case received significant media attention, which helped spread awareness about HOA fraud schemes. David was interviewed by several local news stations and newspapers about how homeowners could protect themselves from similar scams. "The most important thing is to know your rights," David told reporters. "Legitimate HOA actions follow proper procedures with official documentation. If someone shows up at your door demanding immediate payment and threatening arrest, that should be a red flag." David's expertise led to him being invited to speak at community meetings throughout the region about HOA fraud prevention. He developed a presentation that helped homeowners understand the difference between legitimate HOA enforcement and fraudulent schemes. HOA enforcement doesn't happen at your front door with demands for immediate cash payment, he would tell audiences. Legitimate HOA actions involve proper notice, official documentation, and opportunities for homeowners to respond and appeal. The success of the investigation also led to David being recognized by his colleagues at HUD. He received a commendation for his role in exposing the fraud scheme and helping to protect vulnerable homeowners. David's quick thinking and professional expertise turned what could have been a personal victimization into a major law enforcement success. His supervisor, Linda, wrote in your commendation letter. The case became a training example, used by the FBI in courses about white-collar crime investigation. Agent Thompson told David that his case demonstrated the importance of victims coming forward quickly when they encounter suspicious activity. If you had just paid the money and stayed quiet, these criminals would still be out there victimizing other families, Agent Thompson said. Your willingness to report the incident and cooperate with the investigation made all the difference. 6 months after the initial incident, David's neighborhood had returned to normal. The media attention had died down, and life had settled back into its usual routine. But David noticed that his neighbors were more aware of potential scams and more willing to question suspicious activity. Mrs. Chen stopped by David's house one evening to thank him again for exposing the fraud. You saved a lot of people from being hurt by those criminals, she said. I'm proud to have you as a neighbor. David felt good about the outcome, but he remained vigilant about potential fraud in his community. His experience had taught him that criminals were always looking for new ways to take advantage of honest people, and that community awareness was one of the best defenses against fraud. The scary thing is how professional and convincing they were, David told Maria, as they reflected on everything that had happened. If I hadn't had the knowledge and authority that I did, we might have been just another victim in their files. Maria nodded. But you did have that knowledge, and you used it to protect not just us, but dozens of other families. That's something to be proud of. As David looked back on the entire experience, he realized that his Saturday morning yard work had led to something much more significant than he could have imagined. His federal credentials had not only protected his family, but had helped bring justice to an entire community that had been terrorized by sophisticated criminals. The case served as a reminder that even in quiet suburban neighborhoods, residents needed to be aware of potential fraud and willing to stand up to criminals who tried to use fear and intimidation to steal from honest families. David's experience showed that knowledge, courage, and community cooperation could triumph over even the most convincing criminal schemes.